Today, we're joined by a practice director at Donald Insall Associates, who leads their Birmingham and Oxford studios. Matthew is a conservation architect with extensive experience across sectors: heritage, adaptive reuse, and retrofit projects, ranging from contemporary new builds to Grade 1 listed buildings and scheduled monuments. He is also an AABC accredited and sits on the RIBA Principal Designer Register. Alongside practice, Matthew is deeply involved in shaping the future of the built environment through his role as co-chair of the Birmingham Civic Society. In this episode, we'll be discussing retrofit thinking, retrofit first thinking, the value of heritage buildings, skills and education in conservation architecture, and how the next generation of architects can engage with this vital area of practice. Matthew, welcome to Drawing the Line podcast.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
No, thank you very much. I wanted to jump right in, Matthew, and talk about the buzzword and buzz phrases of retrofit first and adaptive reuse. So let me create a scenario. So if you're to be stuck in a lift with policymakers, people in the government, developers and clients, how would you sell them the idea within sort of 20, 30 seconds and the importance of retrofit first and adaptive reuse?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, the main thing is I mean, I think we all accept, the climate emergency. There has to be a solution for us as a society. We know that a huge proportion of CO2 produced by our country from building stock. It's vital that we find a solution to reducing that CO2. And, we're all experiencing the cost of living crisis, the ever increasing cost to heat and to use our buildings, and this has a really dramatic effect on us. And I think just as the oil crisis in the 70s really accelerated the desire for the public to reduce energy costs to insulate their buildings, we're going through a new energy crisis where I think members of the public are going to become more and more sensitive to the cost of living, the cost of heating and use in their buildings, and begin to demand improvements. And I think that policymakers are obviously very driven by industry pressure groups, by mass volume house builders who, are not keen on air source heat pumps or increasing technical constraints on buildings. And there needs to be pushback on that. Because the more and more houses we build, we need a lot of more houses. We need to make sure these buildings are efficient, or the problem is just going to get worse and worse, and it's more and more difficult for just normal members of the public, by me, to live. So I think it's in everyone's interest.
That's good.
There's a abundant, almost, I feel like there's so many buildings, let's say in Birmingham, there's so many buildings that are derelict, that just sitting there and not doing anything. And instead of creating new high-rises, new buildings, a complete new dig, the opportunity to reuse those buildings and with more character, I think it's definitely more, it should be on everyone's priority, on the top of the list. Me personally, I would always champion adaptive and reuse first. It makes the building way more interesting with the context. And we'll probably talk about some of your favorite projects that you've worked in the past, and why and how, what makes it good, what makes it better than starting scratch.
And just touching up on that as well. So then one of the sub points of that would be the incentivization through government and through policy. I've never worked on a heritage project. I'm still quite early on in my career, but what are the arguments from both sides, I suppose? Because from what I've heard online and what I've read is there's incentivization or VAT exemption for new build development. Is there anything similar, or are there any incentives from the government, from top down, to focus on adaptive reuse or retrofits, for instance?
Well, there's very little. I mean, in going back to George Osborne's time as Chancellor, I think in 2009 was when that exemption was removed from historic buildings, from listed buildings. So that exemption, that incentivisation has existed in the past and was removed. And then for a long period, up until very recently, we had what's called LPOW, Listed Places of Worship Grant, where, kind of a level down, historic churches or places of worship also receive that exemption, and that's just in the process of tapering out. So, it's these incentives have existed and really should be brought back or maintained, I think is the main thing. I mean, in terms of why people are attached to historic buildings, you know, why they bring character, you know, things like, you know, textbooks like the Manual for the Streets tell us that, you know, when we're planning, you know, urban design developments, we should be thinking about listed buildings and the character and the sense of connectedness that they bring to developments compared to new build. And I know I got into conservation when I came out of uni. I was very much interested in contemporary buildings, modernism, and what I discovered very rapidly is how attached the general public are to historic buildings and existing buildings, and how much passion the general public show for existing buildings compared to architecture generally, you know. And you know, David Chipperfield's talked about this when he was building the Noise Museum. You know, he had a lot of pushback from everybody, but he said, you know, words to the effect of, what this shows is how much people care about architecture, and as architects we need to support that. If people care, if they're pushing back, if they're shouting about something, that shows that they're attached, and that's what we want. You know, we want the public to care about what we're doing and to kind of challenge us, you know. So you know, that's a really good reason to maintain historic buildings, or, you know, buildings that have a kind of social meaning. You know, to improve people's connection, to create better places. And, you know, at the end of the day, the reason that buildings don't get conserved or do get demolished is because it's just easier, you know. And if, you know, the kind of commercial environment, the capitalist environment, will always do what is easier and generates profit, you know, which I've got sympathy with, because if you can't generate profit, then you can't do it.
You don't have a project.
Yeah. And there's loads of risk.
Yeah,
there's loads of risk in it as well. So it's all got to balance up. And I think if we want developers to maintain historic buildings, they've got to have some profit, and that involves some incentivization.
Absolutely. When I ask a controversial, or say a statement, so do you believe that a lot of the new builds are so less?
Well,
because developers are trying to maximize their capital return on investment, so trying to cram in as many units as they can, and and then they've got commercial let spaces at ground floor typically, and then there's a reduction now of amenities, or rather it's increasing. Amenities are increasing, but historically in apartment blocks there haven't been many amenities available, so there's no life within the compound, within the place, and then there's not much life on the street either.
Well, so I mean, let's talk about the concept of conservation deficit. So if I buy a house for £1 million, I spend £1 million on it, and at the end of it, it's worth £1.5 million. There's a deficit of £500,000, and that's why you have so many unused buildings around Birmingham, historic buildings which, if they were in London, would be immediately occupied and snapped up with no problem. But because of the relative depression of the Midlands economy, these buildings remain unused because they just don't stack up economically. So the same goes for new build, really. If you want to build things in Birmingham, you've got to make a profit somehow, and that means that you've got to somehow make it stack up, and that means maximise its height. You know, buying the site for as cheap as possible, get rid of any constraints which make it expensive to develop it as high as possible with the lowest quality cladding materials. You know, make the buildings the units as small as possible, have the least amenity space to make the most profit out of it, because otherwise it just does not stack up and it doesn't get built. You know, it's just the reality that developers face, and it has an impact on everybody else, because there's very little that the city can do to push back to get those houses that we need, because it doesn't stack up.
And not to mention the challenges, especially, I think this leads quite nicely to sort of one of our talking points is that, you know, what are the challenges of almost persuading a developer or client to pursue a adaptive and reuse route, rather than just completely leveling the ground and start new. And hopefully that you can maybe give us some sort of first-hand insight on not just convincing people to actually do it. Like you said, it doesn't stack up sometimes, and then therefore people choose the easy route. But there's also challenges when you get on site, when you when you have a building that's, I don't know, 50, 100 years old, and the moment you open it up, it's like the word that we used back in the day when we worked on the roundhouse is like opening a can of worms. So no developer, no contractor wants to take that risk, and you end up going through a very weird procurement route where they don't want the risk. They want to give the risk just as much as to the client as themselves and the developer. So so are there any sort of constraints, challenges that you face as a conservation architect, not just from obviously planning persuasion, but also in other aspects as well?
Well, I think what you mentioned there is a really good example of what's common across most conservation projects. That, you know, you're dealing with existing constraints, and it's always going to be there's going to be a clearer path to success if you have a level site. You can just design it from scratch and, you know, deal with existing, create your own set of constraints, essentially. And I mean, things like the Building Safety Act have made this harder. There's much more of a requirement now for developers and design teams to do upfront design work. And some of the projects I worked on maybe 10 years ago, which were design and build, I find mind-boggling now. You know, the rate at which we were designing things while building, and how impossible that would be to do.
Build and then design.
Yes. Well, this is it. It was sort of design, you know, build the foundations while you're still trying to work out how the roof's going to be constructed. You know, so I guess there's a cultural movement away from that for sure. And that is going to benefit retrofit, because if there's much more upfront thinking, then there's much more of an opportunity to make sure you're doing things right, you know, and BIM as well, you know, taking the time to use BIM properly and think through the options and make sure you've got the right strategy. I think Westminster Council recently has changed their validation policy such that existing buildings have to have the business case for retrofit as part of their application process, because of the Marks and Spencer store on Oxford Street. So there now has to be a business case for why you're not retrofitting before you can get permission. So, I mean, that's entirely sensible to me, because anybody should be thinking in those terms anyway. Work out, would it actually be simpler to retrofit our existing building than to knock it down and start again? Because, you know, there are challenges to retrofit, but there are also, you know, aspects of laziness, and aspects of just being so risk averse that you perhaps don't pursue these opportunities.
Interesting. So you mentioned the Marks and Spencer as a case study. So what are these metrics that the councils will be measuring you against? And are the people within the council educated to that level to be able to look out and find out where these constraints might lie? For instance, financial viability is one. Is that the only one? Is it purely based on the financial viability, or is it based on challenges of procuring materials, for instance, to improve the EPC or the energy efficiency of the building?
Well, that's a really difficult thing, isn't it? Because at the moment, there's a requirement for a viability statement in buildings of a certain scale. And I think there's widespread suspicion that sometimes those viability statements overemphasize the lack of viability. So it's kind of creating a negative business case, in a sense, where if you can demonstrate that there's very little profit in a project, it gives you license to give less back and make more profit. You know, I understand the mentality behind that, because you start in a project, you want to make a profit, but you've also got the risk. But the viability statement should be accurate, and it's very difficult actually to challenge them and for councils to have the skills in house to challenge them. So you then have the same problem with environmental impact, which is incredibly difficult to measure. You know, things like as long as I've been involved in thinking about this, about 20 years, the steel and the concrete industry have both been arguing that they're the most sustainable, all things considered. You know, and steel can be more viable or more sustainable because it's quick to build, you can recycle it, there's lots of benefits.
Yeah.
Concrete is slower to build, but it has thermal mass, and sometimes clients make decisions like, for example, biomass boilers, which sound excellent in their own right, but then we had clients who found when the war in Ukraine started, that a lot of biomass pallets actually come from Ukraine. So we're pulling biomass across the world,
transporting it.
Transporting it across the world in order to save CO2 in the UK, which is nonsense.
Yeah.
So there's such complexity in the accounting of environmental impact. There's so much opportunity to argue that one strategy is more sustainable than it really is. So it needs to be done, but there's challenges there. If there isn't the drive from industry to be sustainable, and there isn't the stick, then it just won't happen.
Yep. It was interesting because that statement reminded me of a conversation I had with Grafton architects, where so I posed them a question saying, over the last sort of 10, 15 years, you've always built and designed pure mass concrete, monolithic concrete, and they've now got a couple of mass timber construction buildings. So how much criticism comes your way? And Shelley's response was, just because you see a building that's made of mass timber does not directly and automatically make it green or sustainable, eco-friendly. Because A, you have to question the context. Where is it? Where did the timber come from? Is it European or is it Far East? What are the joinery pieces involved? What sort of glue was involved? Because glue lamp is, well, it's not just pure timber, is it? It's layers and layers and layers of glue, and then production, and then the transportation adds to it. So you have to ask yourself, is it easier to use locally sourced brick, concrete, clay, or do you import? So it's about weighing up these options, really.
Yeah.
But there's no one right or wrong, I suppose. So what are the practices maybe that you guys implement within the office to be able to argue these points? Is it embodied carbon calculations, or is it some sort of other different sustainability metrics?
Well, it's something we're really experimenting with. I mean, we're developing a tool in-house at the moment, based on some of the other systems, say systems that Field and Clegg Bradley have, or that Arup have developed to assess this, because it's very difficult in historic buildings to capture a lot of this information. We do things like air pressure testing before the work is done to understand how leaky the building is. We do things like look at existing energy. We work with consultants like Max Fordham who are really supportive of these techniques. Projects like Knowsley Road Baths, we analyse what would be the cost of using natural gas versus air source heat pumps, and projected that and built that into it. But in terms of developing a tool for everyone to use, there's a long way to go, and it's going to be very difficult at any time to understand. I was reading earlier about having the drive to have a single construction regulator. When are we going to have a passport for each construction product to understand what the data is, so that we could put that into a database? When is NBS going to tell us the carbon footprint of everything that we're specifying, and have that connected to BIM in such a way that we can decide, do all this? It's like the technology's been there really for years and years. It's just the construction industry getting itself together to coordinate it, so that we can do these things which seem to be simple pragmatically.
I just wanted to go back to that the incentive aspect, because I've worked, prior to moving to London, I was in Birmingham, and then a lot of the project that we work on, it seemed to have how do I put it? Not everybody sort of is geared up for adaptive and reuse, but however, the London climate is a little bit different, I feel. So nobody's building new stuff. They are all looking at adaptive and reuse. What's the key? I wondered if you had any sort of inside knowledge on this. What's the key driver between the two cities, and why is one doing more than the other, and what can people in Birmingham, or developers or architects or designers, do in Birmingham to push that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. A couple of projects which are worked on in London I was looking at a new potential project yesterday, where there's a very a well-regarded lead architect who is supporting with conservation, and they are doing a deep retrofit of an existing office block from the 80s. It's in a very sensitive historic area, and I mean, I guess that's one incentive, because if it's already there, it's a lot easier to get permission for it. Even if it's not listed, it's in the context of lots of listed buildings. But the other aspect of it is I think speed, and the drive to get something to market and start extracting value from it is so high, particularly in London, that there's much more incentive to retrofit because it's just faster. Both in terms of planning, but also just in terms of the construction of it. And because land is so much more valuable there, it makes it much easier to work 24 hours construction sites. So retrofit is, I think, faster. If you've got an existing building that works, then surely upgrading it is going to be much faster than designing and building the whole thing from scratch and getting consent in a really sensitive area.
And I guess there's like you said previously, there's more profit to be made if it's the shell is there, and what they're doing is to adapt it and reuse it and evolve on it. It's really interesting, because when I was this is something that happened back in the days. So last year I did go and have a sort of an interview with Gansler's before I moved there, and then most of their project in London is actually looking at adaptive and reuse, and they were the one thing that they were really keen about my portfolio was that I worked on conservation projects, and I worked on using the existing shell and bringing up new buildings behind it. So they really do celebrate that aspect here. And I think if there's anything that we can do, and then I think Birmingham does do that, like the botanical garden that is coming up. But this kind of leads to the next question. Like, there are people that are interested, especially for someone like AB students. How does one actually even get into, because all of most of the projects that we work on these days are within the office. It's
high rises, and even at university as well. The sites they're given.
If someone's interested, interested in the existing fabric, and they want to get into the conservation route, how do someone that's doing a part one or part two even begin, or how do they explore that interest?
Well, I got into it through quite an unusual route. I mean, I started training as a technician, and was just very interested in modern buildings, international style, and when I got into practice, a really small practice in Derby, a lot of the projects that we were doing were, house extensions, some new build housing, but some of it was barn conversions and listed buildings. And I got a lot of interest in it, and I started thinking about it a lot. I mean, I was looking, that course had a kind of a module on conservation, and was kind of, got a bit of an insight into architectural history as well. So I think it's when you've got that interest, take opportunities to work on existing buildings, because a lot of people don't want to, and sometimes in big contemporary practices, the projects which involve listed buildings or existing buildings are actually the ones that people aren't interested in working on. But take those opportunities, and when you're studying, if there's a module, if you get to choose which unit to go into, for example, choose the one that's interested in heritage, learn about it, read about the philosophy of it. That's a big part of it. And read about technology, technology of wattle and daub and historic timber repair and brickwork repair and stone, because there's a lot to learn. And I sometimes find it difficult to find the time to keep reading that stuff. It's like, and especially when you're at university, that's the worst time to read stuff, because there's no time to actually read anything. It's the year out where you might get a chance to actually read a book that you want to. you know.
Yeah.
And so take that time, you know, and learn about it. You know, join, you know, historic building societies, you know, like the Society of the Protection of Ancient Building or the 20th Century Society. Get involved, you know, and I mean, you know, we don't take on a lot of people who've got a master's in conservation. You know, most of the people we take on at Donald Insall, you know, we've got about 150 staff, have just built up an interest and have some experience, and we virtually train them ourselves. You know, so there's lots of ways to get into the industry as long as you've got a demonstrable interest in it.
So for part one or part two coming into your office, or you're looking for part one or part two, is there any sort of particular quality that you're looking for within their portfolio, or is there something that, obviously for part one they wouldn't have the experience, or they might have done some sort of adaptive and reuse project in their uni work, but like you said, you know, if is the interest in sort of the details, reading up on the histories, is there a particular portfolio that you look at, or is it just general part one? They have the interest in conservation, and you train them up.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the main thing is people having an interest in it, because we get a surprising amount of job applications for people who don't describe themselves as having an interest, and they're probably applying on spec to lots of jobs, you know. But you know, when we see people who've got, you know, say they've got an interest, but you know, maybe they've done a project at uni on a historic building and they've really enjoyed it, or you know, they're members of societies, or they've, you know, maybe they've visited historic buildings, and you know, they're building up that knowledge. You know, that's what we're looking for, and really interesting problem solving, because you know, virtually every building that we work on is a unique problem. You know, we're trying to, you know, and retrofit is like this. You've got an existing building that you're trying to solve, and you have to understand from first principles why you're doing things, breathability, you know, how different old and new systems interact, and everything's a new challenge. You know, so having that mentality that every building is new, and that you have to teach yourself from scratch, and that you want to learn, you know, you want to look at old historic technical guidance and understand why the Georgians built things in a different way, and how we take it from how the Georgians did it to getting high U values and good ventilation, Part M compliance. You know, it's that interest, an interest in philosophy, you know, and you know, I learnt a lot of, you know, philosophy at uni, and then you go into mainstream practice and they say, well, I don't need that anymore. You know, draw some movement joints. You know, in conservation it's the opposite. You know, and people are talking in the office about philosophy and, you know, postmodernism and, you know, traditional versus modern design techniques, and we talk about it all the time, and you know, having that interest and sensitivity to it is, you know, really, you know, important and attractive to us, and people who want to work with us.
Circling back to the question about how student getting into the conservation field, if you may. There's actually also a branch after that, is whether or not if REBA is obviously they're supporting it, but is there anything that they can do, if they're doing anything about, in terms of getting student into the conservation field, adapt and reuse, and if there's anything that they can do to help to support that even further, or just in general, how does REBA come into play with it all?
I mean, I think things like having heritage and conservation as a kind of a CPD criteria for, you know, architects and associate members is you know, a good sign of that. So there's a, you know, a requirement from the REBA that we continue to learn about conservation and you know, provide training on that. I mean, I think in terms of the syllabus, I mean, I always try and be careful not to kind of put any more weight on students' shoulders.
Of course.
I think it's, I mean, I see a lot of historic drawings, you know, I mean, people often say, you know, architects can't draw anymore, students can't draw anymore, you know. And
Ouch.
yeah, well, you know, you sort of, I look at these historic drawings and they're beautifully drawn, but they're also very simple buildings. You know, there's no worry about thermal bridging, about, you know, its environmental performance, about, you know, accessibility. economics, material sustainability, safety. There's no building regulations. There's no concern about, risk assessing the maintenance of building. Buildings have become so much more complex to build over the last, 200 years,
Yeah.
and they're only getting more and more complex. So there's so many things that students have to learn about. I've been through so many kind of cycles of criticism seen in the industry where people say students need to learn more about business, they need to learn about sustainability, about law. What are universities teaching them? There's so many subjects to learn about. So it's really difficult. I do think generally there's an imbalance in that we spend a lot of time learning about kind of really conceptual stuff at uni and not enough about the stuff that you actually find out that you need to learn when you hit your desk on your first day.
Yeah.
That's part one. I was lucky as a student doing technology because we had entire double modules on how to use AutoCAD and 3D Studio Max 2005 as it was in my day. When I went and did my part one after that and my part two, I didn't see any real drive to teach students these basic skills that they need when they hit the workplace. And it's painful, isn't it, having to tool up so quickly. So I think there's some really useful things. It would be great if universities and the REBA pushed through universities and ARB about understanding architecture history, to understand where what we design fits into context, because that's important from a planning perspective, how we're working in the existing townscape. But then kind of like breathable technology versus sealed technology, there's very little consideration of that, and that's important from heritage and retrofit, understanding about how buildings respond to dampness and vapor. And I saw in the news that, that this...
The external wall insulation.
Yes. That something like 98% of these government grants where into external wall insulation has been fitted, it's been done badly. And that there's thousands of houses across the country which now have damp problems out of poorly implemented retrofit. And someone was quoted in the paper this morning talk about how that's going to have such a negative effect on people's, kind of feelings towards retrofits. It's going to make people not want it, and not want insulation, and not want air source heat pumps. It all gets tarred with the same brush. So students need to learn about that technology if they're going to implement it properly, because I think the REBA's taken a really good stand on the Building Safety Act of saying this is an opportunity for architects to take the lead and to take responsibility and be people who lead. And it's the same thing. We need to lead in terms of retrofit, because actually you can't expect provincial building contractors to fit external insulation and air source heat pumps successfully. It's been shown that you need design input.
And if say AB wanted to become a conservation architect today, or he's interested in becoming a conservation architect, what does he need to do? Because I did work with one before, and then I think once you become an architect, there's actually a route, a series of steps that you have to take to actually be qualified or call yourself as a conservation architect. Would you be able to sort of tell us what that route is?
Well, the first thing would be to apply to the openings that we've got in our Oxford studio, currently advertised on our website.
Nice.
And then, in terms of getting accreditation, I got into it through the, just through having an interest and learning about it. To get conservation accreditation, you've either got AABC or the REBA's SCA, which they agreed to be equivalent by those two organisations. The REBA's got kind of then a conservation architect level and a conservation registrant level, so they kind of build it up in stages. But the two top ones are the ones to get, and you basically need 5 years experience working in the field. But that isn't necessarily continuous. It can be that in total, So,
Wait, when you say in the field, you mean within architecture profession as a wider profession, or on conservation projects or heritage projects?
Well, both really. As long as you can say that 5 years ago you worked on a conservation project, then that's enough to fulfil the kind of obligation. And then you have case studies which show, you'd have 5 case studies showing your involvement in conservation.
Competency.
Yeah.
5.
Yeah.
5 case studies.
Yeah, but I mean, they can even be on the same building.
Okay.
If you've been working on, a huge conservation project for 5 years,
Right.
you could have 5 different case studies, because if you're working on something, like a 10 or 20 million pound project, that could be enough to build up 5 case studies in its own right. And then it's, things like a personal statement and CPD record. It's quite complex to put the application together. But if you've got the track record of working in it and hopefully making decisions and advising clients, then it's not hard in its own right, and it covers different criteria. So, philosophical understanding, technological understanding, service delivery. So, project management, running projects on site and advising clients, things like condition surveys. So you can build up that portfolio. I mean, the great thing is you don't have to do it while paying a university.
Yeah.
You can do it while you work.
Whilst you're earning.
Yeah, while you're earning. And once you've got that experience, then you probably need about a week of your spare time to put the application together. So in that way, it's pretty accessible, actually.
And then just to close that sector off, does a conservation architect normally get paid more than a regular architect? Is it because we were
generalist?
We were talking about Chris Williamson about the long life learning and having a specialty within the architecture profession. So conservation is the first thing that sprung to my mind. Is that a conservation architect, that's their specialty, because not regular. I would keep saying regular architect. Not everybody has the experience or competence to work on a conservation project.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of job security in it. That's for sure. I mean, as a business, we very much use RIBA and industry benchmarking to make sure that we're paying it suitable salaries. So I wouldn't say in their own right they're paid more than other architects, but it's very difficult to find experienced conservation architects, particularly ones who are AABC accredited. So there must be a lot of security in it, because those people don't want to move jobs. So I guess they're well looked after.
I'm just going to turn back to the point you mentioned about the external wall insulation. I've got in the notes here saying that we know there's a growing skills gap. For example, a recent retrofit training handbook was published by the UK heritage body or bodies, citing that only a small proportion of professionals feel confident working on pre-1990 buildings. So through your experience when you've worked on these historic buildings, what sort of training is involved or available for the contractor side, for people that actually work on these buildings hands-on? Because as architects, I suppose we're behind a screen and we're pointing fingers here and there and everywhere. But the people that are actually doing the retrofit or the heritage construction work, is there a massive gap or lack of skill sets?
I think there must be. I mean, building contracting generally has been, non-professionalized in that, you don't need to be a member of a profession as a passport into it. I mean, that's changing a lot. I mean, that's, definitely when you get to tier 1 contractors, people who are chartered, members of chartered industry building, people will have come from professional backgrounds, or they may have got into that role from the tools. They're obviously very educated, intelligent and skilled people. The Building Safety Act is going to put more pressure on contractors to have formal training, CPD. I think I know that the industry has a problem in conservation, because I know a lot of specialist contractors who are trying to offer apprenticeships and there's no interest. I don't think the trades are not something which the trades suffer. There aren't enough people who want to get into the trades, which is bizarre, really. And conservation, there should be a lot more interest in getting into, because it's a lot more. I think it's a lot more stimulating, and it's a lot more rewarding. Than say mass house building. You would think there'd be a lot more interest for people to get into it, because there's an opportunity to have a much wider range of skills,
Yep.
you know, and learn more and keep learning. But I don't think there's real practical, you know, a route into those trades, or a way of developing in the same way that it is, for example, in Germany, where it is much more serious.
Okay.
The pathway of apprenticeship and skills and lifelong learning. You know, I don't think in this country we're really, you know, taking it seriously. So, you know, that needs to change. I mean, there's lots of heritage organisations like Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings who, you know, do provide these skills, or try to provide, but they're very small. So there needs to be a lot more, you know, cash from government and investment.
Just want to say, are these societies backed by parliamentary funding, or is it?
Generally not. Yeah, it's they're very small organisations, but then, you know, there needs to be, you know, more support for people to get into retrofit, because they're good jobs.
Yeah,
you know,
of course.
And I think we can all see, especially with, you know, the development of AI, that the kind of skill shift that this country is going to need is going to change. And whereas in the 90s we were encouraged, you know, when I was encouraged in the 90s to go to university, you know, the government at the time wanted 50% of the population to have degrees, and that's becoming, you know, there's diminishing returns in that. Yeah, we need more and more people who can do practical things, and they were well rewarded for it and respected for it, I think, to keep being successful economically.
How does the fee structure work on these heritage or conservation projects? Because you mentioned there saying if a project might be 5 years, 10 years in length, how do you foresee architectural costs popping up? How do you implement or somehow accommodate those costs within? So is it based on you have an original fee and then everything else is sort of variation and you add on to it? Because like Daz mentioned, as soon as you open it, it's kind of worms. You don't know what's underneath the ground. You don't know what's within the building. So are these all added on later? So is there a base fee and then you add things on, or how does it work?
I mean, it varies from, you know, client to client, really. I mean, you know, I've probably delivered about 300 projects for Donald Install in the last 9 years, you know, and virtually every client has a different sensitivity to fee. You know, we do have clients who work entirely on an hourly rate.
Okay.
You know. A lot of clients, particularly if they're charities, have to work on a lump sum basis because they have to raise the money from grants, or they really need to know how much it's going to cost, because if they're a trustee of a charity, then if they run out of money, then it's coming out of their own bank account. Local authorities and government organisations tend to prefer, you know, percentage bases. So it's difficult to structure the fees in the right way. It's about balancing risk. There's a lot of risk. It's about sharing the risk often with the clients. You often have no choice. Often the more exciting projects are the ones where you have to take on more of the risk. Grant funded work, you know, you tend to have to work on a lump sum basis and manage that risk in a competitive situation. You know, we as conservation specialists are often competing with mainstream architects who maybe see this as a loss leader, a cool project, and make their money doing mass housing somewhere else. We don't do that. Everything we do is conservation. So we can't really afford to have loss leaders. So that, you know, doesn't necessarily make us efficient that way. But, you know, the Building Safety Act, which I take a lot of interest in because I'm on the REED Principal Designer Register, you know, is definitely pushing everyone to a direction where thinking about things up front, being on traditional basis, having a, you know, the right investment of fees. That's the way we're all going in. And, you know, behavioural competence is all about, you know, having the, you know, the ethical stance of saying, if you want the job done properly, this is what it's going to cost. Not working out how low you've got to bid to beat your competitors, and then working out how on earth to design it safely for whatever you've agreed to do. You know, and as an industry, you know, we all need to be, you know, charging what it costs to do things properly. You know,
from someone who has delivered so many projects, can I just ask, if is there a project that you personally fell in love with that you've done, and then let's say it wasn't smooth sailing. So there's probably two parts of this question. How can we do a conservation project well, first of all, from, let's say, the beginning, from the appointment all the way to procurement, all the way to construction? What's the best way to do it well? And then secondly, is there a project that you're personally sort of attached to? If you give us an example.
Well, I mean, the one I'm most attached to really is Moseley Road Baths.
Yes.
I mean, I got a job at Glen Howell's next door. That's why I'm just showing my shoulder in 2009, and needed to find a flat. Got on the number 50 bus, landed outside Moseley Road Baths. Thought, what a cool building! Got to get in there somehow. And 9 years later, with sort of 4 months into the building contract, a very complex chain of events that led to me being on the architectural team for that. I mean, that was a building which was just really hard to crack. It was it had closed, or the council had actually built a new swimming pool, and because they thought the building couldn't be used, but the community was just so attached to it, they just dug their claws into it and made sure it stayed open, and that's an example of, the love that the community have for that building is so palpable that they managed to get the council to convince the council to keep it going. And then, worked on a couple of projects which were funded by Historic England, and then through that, was appointed to do a feasibility study with the National Trust and Historic England and Birmingham City Council, World Monument Fund, to work out how on earth to make this building work economically. So part of a big team, National Trust were really key in understanding the business plan, and we, worked through lots of different options to try and tune it. We did condition surveys, understood how the building had to be repaired, how much that was going to cost, where the money was going to come from, how much it was going to cost to maintain it, how to generate enough money for it so it would survive as a business. That's really important. We don't just spend the money on the building and then walk away from it. It has to survive as a building, as a business into the future. Every conservation project is like designing a business, in a sense. Thought a lot about it from a sustainability point of view. This was pre the war in Ukraine, when gas prices suddenly went up. But even then, Max Forden helped us to understand the relative benefits of gas versus air source heat pump, ground source heat pump as well. Balancing the different forms of heating this building, because swimming pools need a lot of hot water.
Yeah.
Understanding it from a significance point of view. What is important to keep, what is less important to keep, what do we have to lose, because it had a lot of, one of its most important features is that it has these slipper baths that were common across the country, in the early 1900s, but are not common anymore. But we had to demolish some of them in order to make the building work. So it's about being sensitive to, if we could afford to keep everything, the job would be very easy.
Yeah.
The hard
It's the
part,
balance, isn't it?
yeah, and making it work. And then being involved in the planning process and convincing people about these things, working with the contractors. We had a contractor who sadly went into liquidation, and we've got Galliford Try now a year later, doing a great job on site. So working with them, coming up with everyday challenges, dealing with these changes. That's very exciting, also scary, and but a lot of fun, especially. One thing that's great about that project is a real one-team attitude, where what makes it such a pleasure is absolutely everyone. The client, which is Birmingham City Council, people on National Trust, the funders, the whole consultant team, the builder, everybody is just so focused on getting the right outcome that you can really concentrate on doing your job instead of having to worry about, meeting the 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 delivery schedule, and when the information release schedule, dreaded information release schedule.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got a group of right-minded people,
Yeah,
all passionate and all looking forward towards the same goal. And I think that's the key aspect for having a smooth running. Well, let's not say smooth running, but
an enjoyable process.
Yeah, enjoyable key project. Absolutely.
I had a question, spin off on that then. That if there is to be one building or one site in Birmingham that you could get your hands on in terms of whether it's through adaptive reuse to retain a building or retain a site to celebrate what it is, what would it be?
I often think about the council as the museum complex, and it's a huge set of buildings which, would be really interesting to replan. I mean, something that, as I say, I used to work at Glen Hells, and I'm just, still, passionate about contemporary design, but making buildings work, and I love space planning buildings and making buildings work programmatically, and I think that would be a really, challenging building to, perhaps introduce new uses to it, make it more efficient, make it sustainable. It's just such a key building in the city centre. I mean, Smallbrook Queensway, let's talk about that. But that would be a cool building. We could find a way to keep that. I think it could be like the Rotunda. I mean, the Rotunda was a bit before my time when I was in Birmingham. But I remember it before it was done, visiting Birmingham, and a lot of people probably thought Urban Splash were nuts taking that on, but it's a great project, a great outcome, and it shows that imagination can create something really special, in a modern building, and I think there is that opportunity for Small Queensway if someone can, make it stack up,
Yeah, really interesting. I was just thinking there are so many different ways to adapt and reuse, and look at the space that we're in right now. This is one of the reasons that why we're shooting it in here rather than in the Howell's office.
Used to be a car garage or a car repair centre.
Yeah, exactly. You've got the machinery that are preserved within the space, and then instead of taking it out, you really sort of champion it. You really sort of make a feature out of it, and I think that's becoming not a new thing, but it's becoming a niche, if you may. It makes the building more interesting. A project I worked on previously, it's in Manchester, and it's opposite the Express building. So again, they were originally looking at demolishing the whole site and then bringing up a new tower, and through a series of let's say battles with the council, it ended up of stripping out maybe, let's say, 45% of the existing buildings that are derelict, that are unrepairable, and keeping some of the facade, and then building a new build sort of semi-tower behind it. How do you feel about keeping, that does that feel controversial to you? Because you've got the fabric that is what was like maybe 100 years ago, and then you've got all of a sudden a glass tower that has completely different. I wouldn't say the two that didn't talk, but it's a modern approach. But then you've got a tower in front of what's just left a skin of what was. So do you still find that, do you still think that is a way of adaptive and reuse, or do you think that's a little bit far-fetched?
Well, I think anything that works is right. And I mean, this is a great building. I mean, I worked next door to it for 5 years and never really perceived the scale of it or thought about the opportunity. I mean, I think what E.H. Smith have done here is amazing. Obviously working with their architect's house, and it's just such a great concept. It's a really cool space. The Civic Society is going to have our AGM here in a couple of weeks, and I think people probably would scratch their heads and say, why are we doing it at a builder's merchant? But then when they get here, and
then you realise
it's such a cool space, and I mean, this is a building which has a kind of people have an emotional connection to it, but it doesn't have any kind of formal status as a building. So you've got to think about the concept of significance. So buildings have they're protected because they have significance and value to wider society, and that's why there's statutory control on what you can do with it. So I think the license that you have to change a building has legal protection, but also ethically depends on what its kind of meaning is. So in a lot of ways, a building like this has a lot of capacity for change because you can almost treat it as a kind of a blank palette and do whatever you want with it. If you like a particular piece of material or a texture, then you can keep it. If you don't like it, get rid of it. Whereas on a listed building, particularly, you don't get to make those choices. You have to understand what it is that's significant and protect it whether you like it or not. And I think that's a big driver as to whether I think reuse projects are successful or not. The degree to which they work within those constraints, really. So, the other side to it is that you often come across well-meaning interventions from the recent past, which are now in bad taste. And the botanical gardens, we've got lots of technical problems that have been introduced in perhaps the 80s or later, which were thought to be a good idea and turn out to be bad ideas. And lots of modern construction which is just being demolished, so that through that demolition the building becomes more historic. So it's about understanding in each instance what you're doing, why you're doing it, and sometimes projects can be where I was going with that is sometimes there'll be a time in perhaps the 80s or 90s or even early where someone thought that they were doing a really kind of cool contrast, and now it's just in really poor taste. So you have to be really careful to think, well, am I doing something which looks cool to me this year, but in 10 years or 20 years it's going to be a bit embarrassing. And that's there's lots of different dimensions to it, and with retrofit as well, the driver is to make the building sustainable, and sometimes that's in conflict with the historic significance, and that's a challenge as well.
So it sounds like what we need is great architects, great people that generally care about conservation, cares about heritage, and great clients as well, that generally cares about the history, and it also needs the support of the government incentive, and so it's a tough job. Conservation is a tough job, but if we got more people like you, like people practices like Donald Insoles, I think everybody can push for conservation, adaptive reuse, retrofit more. We'll get closer towards let's say a circular economy rather than constantly building new mass. I don't know, what do you think?
I just want to say circular economy, and you mentioned first principles earlier on. If you could touch up on what is it about retrofit that's important in terms of its sustainability metrics, but also its energy efficiency, and how do you achieve that?
Well, I think it does come to this business case and the building. So you're thinking in terms of how to make it work as efficiently as possible. Money and environmental efficiency are going to be very heavily connected. So first principles are understanding what you've already got. Doing things like air pressure testing at the start. Looking at your energy costs that you have now, but looking at how the building works practically, what the uses are in it, how you're going to generate revenue from it to afford to maintain it, how to maximise use of the building. I always learned that in a public building particularly, the ideal is to be using every part of it 24 hours a day, because then you generate as much revenue as you can out of it. So it's thinking about how you generate revenue out of the building, then it's going to be really efficient. Maintain as much original fabric as you can, because there's already CO2 in that. Thinking about your supply chain, thinking about the M&E, that's a huge part of it. Thinking about the performance standards. I think often we have very unrealistic standards around performance, that it's going to be within a sort of an 18 to 20 degree, centigrade range for 360 days of the year, which just might not be realistic. and often you can save huge amounts of energy by, just taking that down. So it's about energy, educating clients, having, or clients who are, educated already and, enlightened, really. So it's all about just having a more enlightened industry from every direction, really, and we're seeing that all the time. We do get, you do see these growing incentives from government. So there needs to be more. Without those incentives, it's just not going to happen. There needs to be that stick. Going to happen. But it's also about educating contractors, architects doing their bit, definitely, because we're the main part of every construction project, I think, who goes home and worries about quality. At the end of the day. And that's our role.
And it makes the project long lasting. The quality of it. So this will probably lead to our closing question and closing piece. Like, where do you see the whole climate of conservation architecture, heritage, adaptive reuse in the next, let's say, 5-10 years? And with the help of AI, how do we actually push it, beyond the limits of what we've got today?
Well, I mean, AI is, a massive challenge for everybody who's, working today and joining the workforce, because there's huge opportunities for it and huge risks. The opportunities would be to take the drudgery out of our jobs. The risks are if we allow it to de-skill us and take away, our kind of capacity to cultivate our minds, that you learn at university and hopefully do throughout your career. I worry about students who aren't learning to draw or design themselves because they think that the AI tools are going to do it for them. That just puts them out of a job before they've even got a job.
Trusting them too much.
Trusting them. I mean, I've been experimenting with AI at work. I'm probably an AI skeptic, but I've been setting them up for our own business process because I've discovered how much they can help us do things like take 200, REBA textbooks that we've, downloaded under license and having our own AI agent give us answers from REBA guidance.
Instantly,
Guidance that we trust instead of hallucinating from the internet. That's hugely beneficial for our junior staff who can ask questions that, with the best will in the world, they wouldn't get such comprehensive answers so quickly from their colleagues. But I can look at it and appreciate where it's making mistakes and perhaps tune its response. But if you don't understand how to challenge it and know when it's wrong, then that's going to be very difficult. So students still need to be entering the workforce or building up that tool, box of tools to allow them to understand where AI can help them rather than put themselves out of jobs. But if the efficiency that we could get from businesses of AI could leave more time to design, to spend on considering the options, it could enable us to look at the different options, look at the material supply chain, decide what is the most sustainable, do some of this like massive processing that we really need to look at a building, look at a number of options for a building, look at different strategies and work out, well, would it be cheaper to internally clad it all with metal stud and PIR, or would it be better value to use breathable construction? What is the supply chain? What is the revenue cost? What is the capital cost? All of those complexities, in theory, AI could do for us very quickly and support us.
And specifically for conservation projects, because there's more complexity within that process. And if, like you said, if there's any way that we can build a robust model that can actually bring that process down to even half of its time frame, then we're in good shape.
This is it. I mean, if design team fees currently would be, on a conservation project, perhaps 15 to 18% of the capital cost, there isn't much capacity to increase that and still have viable projects. So we've somehow got to do the same for less or more for the same.
Yeah.
Mm.
You know, and that's really where we need to be, is you know, constantly embracing digital innovation to become more efficient, deliver a better service, deliver better buildings. You know, because sustainability and retrofit is definitely the big challenge in conservation. And you know, 10 years ago it was difficult to get a lift
in an
into a
existing
historic building.
We are progressing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now it's very easy, you know, and,
Yeah.
and Historic England do, you know, the main public body who guide this, you know, are really on top of sustainability, about adapting buildings for climate change. So the will is there. It's just our challenge, you know, as architects, just keep learning and keep being better.
And that we must keep our optimism, I think, for the future. And I think we it's in our hands, it's in AB's hands, the next generation of architects, conservation architects, to shape that the right way and the way that we want it, rather than let it lead us to a path that we don't want.
That we should regret.
Yeah, that's it.
Amazing. Well, Matthew, thank you for joining us today. It was an extremely insightful conversation. Certainly, definitely for me, from a Part 2 apprentice point of view. Then we spoke about, you know, not just adaptive reuse and retrofit and heritage, but also about the economical factors that architecture can contribute towards. That was really insightful. So thank you very much, and thank you to E.H. Smith for allowing us to use the space.
Yeah, it's a really cool space.
Yeah, it's a really cool
so
space.
People who's in towns, they're down in Digbeth.
Yep.
They're a happy bunch of people, and they love to show their bricks. And for architects and designers, honestly, there's hundreds and hundreds
literally
of bricks there.
And then finally, for students that are interested in potentially following a career down into sort of heritage architecture or conservation, please do feel free to reach out to us. As always, Donald Insel are currently hiring, so please take a look at their website for different roles.
Bookmark it.
Yeah,
The Oxford office in particular is looking.
Absolutely.
Yeah. 3, 2, 1. Thank you.
Thank you.